Okay, that looks better. Keep an eye on that. Okay, welcome back. Sociology of religion once more. Okay, it's Friday, obviously. So, happy Friday. Second Friday of the semester. All good. I'm sure it's been a couple of long weeks as you get settled into classes. So, today we are going to keep working on our definition of religion. So, what is religion and all of that fun stuff. And then, we only have a few slides left there. After that, we are going to move into how religion works. Those slides are up on eClass. I put them up this morning while my 4-year-old was eating his Fruit Loops. He ate Fruit Loops. I posted your slides. So, okay. The sugary cereals are only for Fridays. Okay. So last time, right, we got through kind of Smith's definition, right? We went through all of the different parts of it. We've now kind of like looked at each little piece of his definition, in parts and kind of figured out what's inside all of this. And hopefully you now have a good sense of why I think that definition works really well. Okay. We're going to talk about three kinds of discursive practice, or three religious practices according to Reisenbrot, and these are ones that Smith brings forward as well. And these are interventionist practices, behavior regulating practices, and discursive practices. Okay, so we already talked about this one last class, right? These are interventionist practices, and basically, right, these are ways that humans establish contact with the superhuman order to control or manipulate it, right? That try to get its energy or target it in the direction they want. Wearing amulets, performing magic spells or incantations, these sorts of things. Sometimes try to gain fusion with it, right? Through a trance or an ascetic state, whether this is through meditation or drug induced. It can be either one. Activate the superhuman potential that slumbers within the person by reaching a state of enlightenment, right? This would be the goal of a lot of forms of Buddhism, right? But even, you could see that potentially like even in something like Christianity in the saints, right? The saints can be seen as people who've reached, who've in their lives have sort of reached enlightenment and therefore kind of communed with superhuman powers or released that potential within them. And you can think of, I think someone like St. Francis of Assisi, who supposedly could speak to animals, right? And communed with nature on kind of a different level. Okay, yeah, and this is typically done through symbolic actions, prayers, chants, gestures, formulas, sacrifices, vows, or divination. Okay, so Reisenbrot also has some subcategory of interventionist practices that he suggests. Basically, are general practices that within a religion, all of the members of that religion can or even should participate in, right? So there are calendrical practices in particular. So things like, calendrical practices, religious kind of celebrations or calendars that to mark time, usually around 3 themes. Vegetative, right? Seasonal food growth, right? You might have harvest kind of festivals. You see this in Greek mythology, right? Sort of like it was attuned to the seasons, right? And they had particular gods that were, the god of fertility, the goddess of fertility, who, would also kind of walk around the earth and bring about the spring, right? And so you would celebrate these sort of things, right? So things around personal food growth, around, the harvest, these sorts of things, right? So you had those life cycle practices performed on the occasion, such as birth, entry into religious community, affirmation of the latter by young adults, becoming complete members, marriage, dying, and death, right? You see these particularly, like all of these really are built into, say, Catholicism. Catholicism has its 7 sacraments. Can I list them? It's been a while. Baptism, First Communion, confession or first reconciliation, marriage or holy orders. Very rarely can you do both, except in certain forms of Catholicism. Oh, I'm missing one. Thank you. Confirmation, right, which is the entry into adulthood, right? Basically, at about 12, you confirm that you believe these things, and you're supposed to enter then into kind of ownership of your own faith, and then the sacrament of the dying, or last rites, as it's sometimes called, or anointing of the sick when they want to be a little bit less grim. Right, so all of these things are built right into Catholicism, and these are all these kinds of life cycle, right? When you reach a certain point of life, you should participate in these practices. And yeah, I mean, they're variable practices that react to unforeseen or catastrophic events. I mean, think of like the Greeks or the Romans as they faced down the plagues, right? And we'll talk about the plagues when we talk about the rise of Christianity, right? What would they do? They would go to the temple and they would sacrifice, right? They would basically perform sacrifices to try and appease the god. And this was really common in a lot of kind of, Indo-European kind of languages, particularly, right, in the Mediterranean basin and in the Middle East, right? They had like an idea that the gods were, why were bad things happening? The gods were angry, so we had to somehow propitiate their rage, right? Basically like appease them through sacrifice. So not all of those are found in every single religion. Each religion is going to maybe pick and choose certain ones, right? Like Christianity doesn't generally have, say, much to do with vegetative or seasonal growth kind of, rituals. They're certainly possible. But it has, especially in Catholicism and say Eastern Orthodoxy, all of the life cycle ones are basically all there. Okay, so, yeah.
I was just wondering, birthdays also kind of count for life cycles? I know there's some faiths where you don't celebrate your birthday.
Oh, you're talking about the Jehovah's Witnesses. Yeah. So, I mean, I'm trying to remember what the hell the Jehovah's Witnesses prescription against birthdays is, and it's escaping me at the moment why they don't celebrate birthdays. And it is a religious reason, but I guess in this case, that's not a celebration. It's like an anti-celebration, and they have some prescription against celebrating birthdays, but I just...
Not supposed to like celebrate yourself or something like that?
Yeah, I think it's something like that. I'd have to look into it. I mostly have not paid that much attention to the Jehovah's Witnesses, for whatever reason. I come across it now and then. The same thing, like they don't celebrate Christmas either, which is an odd one for a purportedly Christian group. But yeah, I don't recall. But I mean, in that case, right, you would say maybe they have that one kind of taken out. But birthdays, like celebrating your birthday isn't really a religious event either, right? No, I'm just like, in any circumstances, I can't think of any where like people celebrate their birthdays in a religious way, other than maybe giving thanks, for another spin around the sun. But yeah, it's an interesting question. I don't know, and I don't know why the Jehovah's Witnesses have that particular prescription. Yeah, please.
Would the life cycle practices be considered like rites of passage?
Some of them are, yeah. Like not... Like some of them are initiation rites. Like if you think like baptism in Christianity, for example, is definitely an initiation rite. Like, and especially if you go back, it's less so with babies, but it still is because the babies aren't choosing it themselves. So people who do infant baptism, less so. But like in the ancient church, right, it was very much like what would you do? You would strip naked. Fun times. That's why they had female deaconesses, so the women could strip naked in front of the female church official. You would enter the kind of font, right, where you would be baptized, the water pit. You would turn to the west and you would spit, and then you would be submerged in basically rejecting the gods, right, the pagan gods, and then you would be immersed in the water, a ritual drowning or death, and then emerge into new birth. So, that was bad. It's more of a rite of initiation. But yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I have a follow-up. So do these life cycle practices have to occur at like certain ages or certain events? Because I know like certain forms of Christianity, like your baptism can happen whenever, but it is it's an initiation.
Yeah, I mean, So every kind of religion will have slightly different ones, right? So yeah, like in say Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, you can be baptized anytime. It's most commonly done um, when people are infants. I think Lutherans are the same, Anglicans are the same, Presbyterians are the same. Once you get into, I think, Anabaptists and kind of Baptist movements, they want adults to choose it. Now you see, you're testing my like knowledge of Christian history here and theology, in deep and painful ways. There's a sort of twist that happens somewhere around in the 18th, 19th century, where this movement called the Anabaptists sort of reject what's called paedobaptism, or the baptism of children, and instead prefer adult baptism. At the end of the day, right, they sort of have it like whenever a person is ready to enter. So it shifts the kind of where it happens in the life cycle to kind of that moment of awakening. So, that one, would it still be a life cycle one? Probably not as much as, say, infant baptism in, say, Roman Catholicism, or the older forms of kind of Christianity. But then, marriage also can be variable by age. It's just like when you reach a certain stage or some kind of event in life, then you do this, right? Whatever it is, like in evangelicalism, it'd be like when you're born again. I don't even remember the language. And it's not used by evangelicals in the same way as it was 20 years ago, because people don't talk about being born again as much anymore. Now I'm just rambling. Did I answer your question? Okay. Other questions? These are great questions. It's going to be a fun class. No, I'm like serious. Like, I love the questions. It's so much fun. Very engaged. All right. Are we good with those? Okay. Okay, interventionist practices. Some maybe practiced by everybody, right? So I talked about last time, some things like prayers can be practiced by anybody. And like in, say, Catholicism, right, technically anybody can baptize a person as long as they use the right formula. The church would prefer it be the priest, but anyone can do it. Others have to be done, obviously, by advanced religious practitioners, right? Those who've been trained or who have an official kind of job within that religion, right? So in Christianity, those who've been ordained, would be, the typical ones. Other religions, right, have priests and kind of clerics and religious officials that have to do things, right? In ancient Greek and Roman mythology, or religion rather, it was priests that had to perform certain of the sacrifices, right? Sometimes you need advanced religious practitioners. Again, in Catholicism, not everybody can do communion, right? Not everybody can basically transform or perform the rite that transforms the bread and wine into the body and blood of Jesus in Catholicism, right? That has to be done by a priest. And then there's always rules, like how advanced a practitioner do you have to be? Deacons can do certain things. Anyway, there's all sorts of rules. Catholicism is fun. That's why it has a code of canon law that's like an entire bookshelf. And apparently, weirdly, sorry, this is an aside and a pointless one, but someone took the whole code of canon law and put it online and made it searchable. And the Union of Canon Lawyers of America sent them a cease and desist notice because apparently they'd made canon law too friendly. Which, it's like, you've made it too easy. What is the point of even training for 10 years to be a canon lawyer? Anyway, the church has its own laws, and there are special lawyers that basically administer that law. It's called canon law, and they are canon lawyers. Anyway, Catholicism, it's a riot. Okay, yeah. So most people are not advanced religious practitioners, right? And this is, I think, an important thing. You're going to have a range of religious practitioners within any religion. You're going to have those who are deeply committed, right, and who are really advanced. Most people, though, are going to be kind of satisfied with pretty basic religious kind of adherence and observance, right? They're going to stick to sort of the basics. In a lot of cases, do sort of the minimum or not much more than the minimum, right? Because most people frankly, simply don't have time to get really deeply into, theology or religious practice in concerted ways. Advanced religious practitioners, right? Now these can be, in some cases they might be like, priests or priestesses or whatever, like high level monks or those sorts of things. You can find those in many religions. And they may, seek salvation or another religious good at whatever the cost. And you can think of like Buddhist monks, in a place like Myanmar, right, who are dressed in the red and orange kind of robes, right? Those would be, advanced religious practitioners who are seeking, their religious good of detachment from the world, whatever the cost. Most people don't ever get to that point, right? Most people are adherents, but don't go really deep into it. Most people are pretty moderate religiously, or marginally attached, right? Their religion is fairly marginal, right? It may not even be the center of their lives. And yeah, some advanced religious practitioners end up being religious officials, clergy, seers, shamans, mystics, sometimes independent people, mystics or ascetics. And I mean, there's long histories, I know, in Christianity of this, especially like in the early days of Christianity, people just went out into the desert and lived in caves, waiting for the arrival of the kingdom of God and praying all day. These would have been some pretty advanced religious practitioners, or people like Francis of Assisi, right? Wasn't a clergyman when he did most of what he did. He was just a lay person. It's only later that he founded a religious order, the Franciscans. Okay. That was from last time. I still did not look that up. I have to make sure I do. Okay. Behavior regulating practices, right? These are basically religious shaping of everyday life with reference to superhuman powers. Some things are behaviors that are allowed. Other things are behaviors that are disallowed, right? And certainly, if you think of religious prohibitions against this, that, and the other thing, right? There are a ton of them, right? And every religion has its sort of things that are permitted and not permitted. I always think of Judaism because Judaism has some of the most stark ones, right? Judaism, with the laws, it's everything that's written basically in like Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and Numbers are all these rules that Jews had to follow, some of them that they still do. So things like dietary laws, right? Can't eat certain things, like, you can eat the animal of the non-cloven hoof, but the cloven-hoofed animal, that is not okay, right? And if it has scales and fins, yes. If it has fins but no scales, no. That's why Orthodox Jews can't eat shellfish or lobsters or anything like that, because it has fins, but it has no scales. So according to God in Judaism, that is a no-no. Right, so it can disallow certain behaviors, other things like, the killing of certain animals, right? In certain kind of branches of Hinduism, cows are seen as sacred. In Catholicism, right, contraception is not allowed, right? Officially anyway. So, if you're a married couple, you can't be using contraception and be in good standing with the church, right? So lots of different ranges, right? It can range from dietary behavior to sexual behavior to a lot of other things. Like, there are some pretty esoteric ones, right? In Judaism, who can handle your food, how things are supposed to be cleaned. And Judaism isn't alone in this, right? Can you mix meat and dairy? You can't. All sorts of things. Okay. But it has to be, it's not just like for cultural reasons, it has to be in reference to the will of a superhuman power. Okay, so I've got this very cute video. Now that I told you about the Jews, here's a Jewish person telling you about things.
So we are at McDonald's, and we're going to find out what kosher options we have on site.
It's 2 pages long.
Only animals with split hooves who chew their cud can be kosher.
The pigs don't qualify because they have split hooves but do not chew the cud. Very interesting.
Animal must not feel any pain. Animal rights activists.
Fish must have fins and scales. What fish don't have fins and scales?
Shellfish, eel, shrimp, and crab. I love all of those things.
Meat and dairy products should be consumed separately with a 6-hour waiting period in between.
I totally forgot that I had put milk in my coffee this morning.
Hi there, do you have a kosher menu?
I'm sorry.
I'm just gonna have to settle for a milkshake.
Utensils that touch meat cannot also touch dairy unless properly cleaned per kosher cleaning standards.
Find a clean pot that has not been used for 24 hours. This doesn't look like it's been used.
Drop utensils in the pot of boiling water one at a time. Kosher wine can only be handled by Jewish people.
This wine is not kosher.
One exception is that if the wine is heated to almost boiling, it can then be handled by non-Jewish people. Why?
Man, Jews love to boil
This is intense.
I foresee myself breaking this.
I'm ready to do this and go back to my roots.
So I have now officially stocked up for my week of keeping kosher with these 12 bottles of kosher red wine.
I bought this food before we started this video, but I can't eat any of it.
I didn't know what I was going to be able to eat for breakfast, but it turns out these waffles are... Oh no! I literally just dropped all the waffles, but these toaster waffles are kosher.
Welcome to Starbucks. Hopping out today.
Hi there, do you all have a kosher menu by chance?
Do you think this food today is kosher?
I don't know. It's like meat.
I don't know what kosher is.
No, unfortunately, no.
Do you have kosher options? Like,
No kosher options.
What are we looking for, Jen?
Kosher alcohol?
Everyone wants to take a round of Jello shots, but Jello isn't kosher.
I don't know if what I'm drinking is kosher. It's tequila.
Kicks are kosher. Kicks are kosher!
Here's where I'm struggling. Almond milk creamer does not have an OU sign.
I woke up really hungover this morning, and I was really craving a pulled pork sandwich, and I completely forgot about the whole kosher thing, so here I am.
We're about to eat the kosher chicken that Josh prepared.
So I just got back from a camping trip. There wasn't really anything kosher.
Ice cream is hard to find kosher, so we actually got Dole Whip.
Little holiday holla.
I'm like the worst Jew in the world. I just got a tattoo. My Jewish ancestors are rolling in their graves. I think if I learned anything this week, it was that I do not deny myself of like anything that I want.
And I would just walk around the kitchen going, no, can't eat that, can't eat that.
By the end of it, it was pretty simple. Like, it wasn't, like, you could go to a restaurant and even if they didn't know whether or not the meal was kosher, you could kind of tell.
At restaurants and stuff, I guess I would try to just eat whatever seemed the most kosher instead of asking.
I think it would have been easier if I had like a community of people around me.
I went to a Shabbat dinner, which a lot of my friends do, and I don't always go, but I thought it would be a perfect opportunity, A, to hang out with friends, and B, to keep very easy kosher.
All props to people who do this.
I couldn't do it, and you do it every day.
Okay. All right. So the last one are discursive practices, right? Discursive practices are interpersonal communication about the nature, status, accessibility of superhuman powers, their manipulability, and their will, as well as techniques of self-empowerment. Okay, so they hand down and revise religious knowledge about interventionist practices. Right, so religious teaching, catechesis, anytime you're instructing someone in religion or discursing about religion and religious practices in particular, this is all kind of discursive practices. And this, is part of that cultural aspect of handing down the faith in some way. Okay, video again.
Will my dog Pepper be there? I'm sorry, but the answer is no. Why not? Because heaven is for people. What about my cat, Snowball? I'm sorry, but the answer is no. Will there be cavemen in heaven? Certainly not.
Ma'am, what if you're a really good person, but you're in a really, really bad fight and your leg gets gangrene and it has to be amputated? Will it be waiting for you in heaven?
For the last time, Bart.
No. Okay, right. So this is something like Sunday school, would be, and this kind of scenario in The Simpsons, where people are learning about, theology, or typically, here learning about how to commune with the divine. This would be, part of these discursive practices. Okay, how are we doing with all that? Good? My typical questions people are all good. Oh, catechesis. Sorry. Again, me assuming people know what words mean. Specific religious words. Catechesis is just basically the teaching of the faith in Christianity, right? So it comes from a Latin word. I can't remember what the Latin word is. But to catechize someone is to teach them about the faith, right? Yeah, please.
I'm just wondering on the whole, like specific people with specific levels of or like knowledge can only do certain things. I know they have those websites where it's like, oh, like become a priest in like 10 easy clicks. Like I know people who've done it, and they're like, yes, this is now holy water because I decree. So is that considered like sacrilege or not even applicable? Or
I would think so, because I mean, I guess it would depend on the religion. Maybe there is the religion of the online ordination. What's that?
It's usually like the Christianity.
Yeah, I mean, to be a Catholic priest, it's like 7 years of seminary, right? It's not an easy thing, and I mean, it's for Lutherans, Anglicans, Orthodox, it's all kind of the same thing. So that to me seems like a pop culture-y sort of like, a slightly sacrilegious way of doing things. Giving people essentially with no training the power to, confect holy water. Seems sacrilegious to me, but I'm not 100% sure.
So would it, like, let's say I get baptized by someone who did one of these little online quizzes, and then I go to my church and be like, yeah, I was baptized, and I hand them the certificate. Would they be like, that's not valid? This is just some person who had $20 to spare.
So this is like the legal questions I get in youth and justice, or youth crime and society, like very specific theological questions. It would depend on who you're talking to and kind of which, like in the theory, and I'd have to check other groups, but in theory, as long as it was done, the person is a Christian, and it was done using the proper formula, theoretically in Roman Catholicism, that might be considered valid. They would probably do an investigation, but honestly, like interview the person and figure out, like, did they use the right form, which is just like, I baptize you in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. As long as you use those words, I think technically it could be considered. And I only know this because an acquaintance of mine, like from back when I was in undergrad, was confused about this because some random stranger in the park, they had met them and talked religious things, and the person took out a water bottle and like baptized them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And then the church had to do an investigation as to whether this was valid. And because they couldn't find the person, they didn't know who it was, they concluded that was so there's rules about it. But then, I don't know, in like other forms, it would be like, unless you did baptism by full immersion, right, then it wouldn't be counted. So there's all sorts of rules, and different religious groups, I probably should have just opened with that. Different religious groups are going to judge that based on their own criteria as to whether a practice done by, let's say, less advanced religious practitioner who just bought their certificate online would be valid. Please.
What would like singing hymns or like religious like worship music, what would that count?
I mean, I think this is just sort of like, okay. This could be a complicated question in a sense, right? Some of them could be in interventionist practices, right? Because in some, like in Judaism, some of the prayers are sung, right? In Orthodoxy, a lot of the prayers are sung. So these could, in theory, be considered interventionist practices because you're praying, asking for certain things. In others, I think they're just like standard religious practices, right? That probably lean more towards the discursive, even though they're not really, some of them may not be teaching you anything, like rocking out your CCM playlist on your, off of Spotify, probably sort of fits into discursive practices more than interventionist ones. But in some cases, I think it could be both. It's depending on, again, we're talking about a Christian context. It would depend on how they're being used, right? So does that make sense? Okay, religions are complicated, and every one of them has their own unique and fun rules. Okay, maybe I'll come back to that question. Okay, done with that. So now you all understand what religion is, hopefully. Maybe.
There's a question.
Where? Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see you.
I was just wondering about like.
I have to open my slideshow again.
Practices. So if you were to just like go to a church and listen to like their sermon, is that like a discursive practice? Like my church doesn't have like Sunday school or like little kid teachings or whatnot, and our practices aren't taught in like the church setting.
Okay.
So
I mean, yes. No, I think so, in the sense that, right, you're probably this, whatever the sermon is or the message or however they kind of put it down. And I remember yours is a very unique kind of situation. We talked about this. She was in sort of youth, and we talked about the particulars of her religious group. Not in class, just with her. But yeah, I mean, I think if they're communicating, things about the nature, status, and accessibility of superhuman powers, right? Like probably there is like, I don't know, how do you pray? Who is God? What does God want? It's just reading the Bible.
And like,
I mean, and probably commenting on it in some way. Yeah, I think that would fit into discursive practices, even though maybe because I think all of that would be kind of contained within it. But yeah, it's not, your situation's a little bit unique in that it sounds like there's less like direct teaching. But, I think that still sort of falls within it, right?
And then to follow up, does each religion have all three types of practices?
So interventionist practices, discursive practice.
Yeah.
I mean, to some extent, I would think so. Now, that's not, again, to say that everybody who is an adherent would necessarily follow, like, say, behavior regulating practices, right?
But built into the foundations of each religion will be
some kind of behavior regulating practice, right? And yeah, definitely discursive practices. There's some kind of communication of the core tenets and beliefs about, the nature of superhuman powers and all of those things, right? And yeah, some kind of interventionist, like I'm assuming there's some kind of prayer or communing with superhuman powers. Otherwise, it's not a religion. So, are we good? All right. I've now hopefully cleared all those questions. Oh, my computer is losing its mind. Okay, so how religion works. This is not what is pictured in this, but I found a picture on Google image search, how religion works. So I threw it in there. Okay. This is it. Oh, I had a Slido in there from last year. Don't worry about that. You can definitely ask questions using this Slido if you like. Seems like people are more just hand raising, and that's great. Okay. So, we talked about, those discursive practices, those interventionist practices, but what about the other things that we tend to think of? And especially when you think of, say, like a Durkheimian sort of definition of religion, that functional definition, right? That it gives community, right? It gives identity, it gives common values, so the things that aren't maybe included in Smith's definition of religion, right? And so, because we do tend to think of, religion as having, trances or ecstatic experiences, communities, right? Religious groups are typically communities of some kind. Identity, it fosters certain identities. Aren't those all constitutive of religion as well, beyond just, practices and premises about superhuman agents? And according to Smith, and it's his definition, so obviously he doesn't think those are important, or he would have put it into the definition. These are all secondary aspects of religion. Like, they are there, or some of them are, but they're not necessarily core to what religion is, right? And I think what this is sort of anchored in for Smith is the fact that these things, right, identities, communities, and such, are also offered by other social institutions that also do these things. And so if you include these, what he thinks are secondary aspects of religion, you get into Robert Bella territory, where suddenly you're like, well, is American nationalism also a form of religion? And you get, Bella's sort of thesis on American civil religion being a sort of secular religion. And that's, I think, what Smith is trying to avoid by calling these secondary aspects. Okay, so yeah, according to Smith, the essence of religion is those culturally prescribed practices that are meant to access superhuman powers for things like blessings, help, and to avoid things bad. The other things we think of, right, when we think of religion are byproducts and supports of those practices, right? Community, ecstatic experiences, etc., can all exist outside of religion, right? Like you could have your brony fan group online, right? And you could think of that as a community, and yet that is not a religion, and it's offered by other social institutions. So what Smith is really trying to do is pare down his definition to only what religion does exclusively, right? Rather than what it shares with other institutions. Admitting that, you know, you're going to have some shared aspects with other kind of social structures, but those then are not constitutive of what makes a religion and not just a social club, right? Okay. You know, one of the things that Smith also notes is that, you know, the community, the ecstatic experiences, you know, the identities for religious groups, the reason we kind of can know that they are secondary products rather than the core of what a religion is that if you remove the religious aspects right, the culturally prescribed practices, the beliefs and all of that stuff, those secondary aspects start to break down really, really quickly. So we'll talk about, you know, when we look at the religious landscape, which is not for a little while, but one of the things we'll note is that so mainline Protestantism, and this is a branch of kind of Christianity that split from Catholicism after 1517, right? So Martin Luther, Protestant Reformation. Hopefully you've all heard this history. If you haven't, you know, well, the education system has failed you. And I can't fix everything, but nor can I fix many things, actually. Protestantism splits from Catholicism, and basically the older Protestant churches, right, your Lutherans, your Presbyterians, your Methodists, some Northern Baptists, as opposed to Southern Baptists, there's a lot of them. Anyway, there's a whole bunch. Basically what's happened through the 20th century is in some way, shape, or form, a lot of them sort of lost a lot of what would make a religion, particularly things like beliefs in superhuman powers, right? So a lot of them became little more than sort of secular humanist kind of clubs. I mean, you can say like the United Church, so it's not true of every United Church. In Canada, there's a very famous case from, say, Toronto, where the priest of United Church declared herself to be an atheist, and the United Church was like, should we remove her? Nah, it'll be fine. Wherein she very quickly went about removing all religious aspects of it, you know, took out prayers and put in like these sort of secular humanist creeds. And very quickly thereupon, the whole thing collapsed like a house of cards, right? Attendance dropped, and the place was basically essentially forced to shutter its doors, more or less. And this has been a kind of ongoing trend for the United Church in Canada, you know, a sort of secularization, a loss of belief in superhuman powers, or in this case, God or a superhuman power. And therefore, you know, those identities and those bonds that held together the communities all kind of broke down. You know, people lost their identity as a member of the United Church. And I was just looking at the stats yesterday, right? In 1971, 18% of Canadians were members of the United Church. Today, that number is 3%, and by 2030, you know, they will likely have all but disappeared, and they will be so small that, you know, Statistics Canada will no longer be able to measure, you know, them as a percentage. So, even worse if you're an Anglican, right? I think the Anglicans are down to like 1.2% or 0.9% or something. It's a bad story, but this is what's happened, right? A lot of those beliefs in the superhuman, the supernatural kind of disappeared. They adopted a lot of mainstream kind of cultural practices, but the appeal of the religion then kind of faded away. Please.
How come some religions are falling apart like that, whereas other religions are gaining more followers?
This is a very good question. There's a lot of theories. I mean, some of it is birth rates, right? In some cases, there are some religions that simply have much higher birth rates. But it does seem, when we get to the religious landscape, and when we get to theories too, we'll talk about like strictness theory, which kind of tries to address this point. But that religions with stricter rules and those that maintain supernatural belief tend to do better over time, right? And it kind of works with Smith's definition too, because, you know, what he sort of says is what people really want out of religion is access to superhuman powers, or, you know, it's religion, right? If people wanted a social justice club that feeds the homeless, they would go do that. You don't need the religious kind of layer on top of it. So all of that is kind of a secondary product. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Could we argue that maybe Smith didn't include this in his original definition because it's almost implied, like churches do bring community, like experience, like whatnot. So it's like let's say you have groups, so it would provide that, but for it to be considered a religious group, then it needs to match that definition.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then if you take away that reference to superhuman powers, it's actually pretty stunning with the rapidity to which that community falls apart, right? Because the thing holding it together is that attempt to access superhuman powers. And I think the example of the mainline Protestants is a good one. I have a chart that just shows like the decline of the mainline. It's like a straight line down. It's pretty stark. Okay. Yeah, I mean, these things might be still important to people, like that last point, right? You know, if you talk to religious people who are part of religious communities, a lot of them will point to, oh yeah, you know, it's the community, it's the getting together, right? It's the shared values. You know, I remember talking to one of my students last year who was a Sikh, and, you know, a kind of, I would say, non-believing Sikh, like who didn't believe in the religious aspects of the religion. But, you know, for her, those things were really important. So she continued going through the religious practices, because without that, her whole community was kind of gone. And she's like, that's what kept her anchored in it, even though, you know, she was fairly secular. Now, a couple generations on, if everybody stops believing it, that probably falls apart. But anyway, you know, it's not that it's not important to the people in it, right? They would all point to community as an important thing, as maybe even ecstatic experiences, right? Or other things that religion brings as secondary products. But for Smith, without that kind of core of accessing superhuman powers, it all kind of falls apart. I got shockingly less done than I wanted to this time. Okay. Identity. All right. So personal identity. Group identity and social identity, Smith thinks, are all important secondary products of religion. Again, they come out of religion in lots of ways, but all of these things, and I think, right, to be attuned to it, all of these things can exist in contexts outside of a religion, right? So a personal identity, right, a distinct personal self-understanding. Religious identity often shapes a person's sense of self, right? You know, certainly someone who is an Orthodox Jew will feel themselves deeply shaped by that identity as an Orthodox Jew, right? And that one's pretty interesting because there's lots of things that mark out Orthodox Jews. Like for men, it's a skull cap, but what is it called in Judaism? And it's on the tip of my tongue, right? They all have to wear the kind of head covering. Yarmulke. Thank you. Yes, the yarmulke. It's a different word in Catholicism because like bishops and priests also wear it. It's called a zucchetto, and I was getting the words mixed up. A yarmulke, right? So that one marks them out particularly as having that identity as being Jewish, so it tends to merge those things very strongly. Group identities, right? Individuals' understanding of their identity derived from membership in a social group or institution, right? So people think of themselves as Hindu, they think of themselves as Sikh, they think of themselves as Roman Catholic, right? Just drive around Edmonton for long enough, right? And that group identity becomes obvious just by looking at the things hanging off people's rear view mirrors, right? Like in one car, you'll see a rosary. In another one, you'll see the symbol of Hinduism, right? And people will hang all sorts of stuff from their rear view mirrors. It used to be just rosaries, but now it's, or fuzzy dice, I guess. But now it's, I see lots of religious symbols kind of hanging from people's rearview mirrors, and I'm always kind of, especially Hindus. Hindus seem to have adopted that practice of hanging like the symbol of Hinduism. I forget what it's called, from the rearview mirror, and I just note it, and I'm like, oh, cool. That's really interesting, right? But it's this kind of signaling of that group identity. I'm part of this group. I am part of, I'm a Catholic. I am a Hindu, right? Those group identities are very, very important. And obviously, Muslims as well, any religious person, right? That identity and that belonging to the group of religious people is very, very important to them. And the social identity, that social group's collective sense of belonging, which emerges from joint self-definition, common social location, and shared emotional investments, right? That kind of identity as a social group, right? The group to which, like, not just a group as in like the religious organization to which you belong in terms of the institution, but the particular community and social group that you belong to, right? Which comes from, a lot of things, common, joint self-definition. And this can be all sorts of things. It can be just straight religion, right? Or it can be a mix of religion and ethnicity, right? Somali Muslims versus, say, Lebanese Muslims, Polish Catholics versus German Catholics. And there used to always be, Catholic churches for each ethnicity. To some extent, there still are. Common social location, right? You're all in the same place. And shared emotional investments, right? The things that these communities care about. Okay, I'm out of time. More or less. Any questions before I let you go? We'll cover this. Yeah, Maya. It's Maya, right? Maya. Close.
Is there research showing that religions with a more identifiable identity do better? Like going with the strictness theory,
There's certainly some research that suggests that stricter religions, especially those that have more bounded understandings of particular theology, do in fact do better, right? And they tend to be more persistent.
I'm wondering, because if you can easily identify other people in your religion, then it might strengthen the community aspect.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. But definitely, I think belief and theology there, I think, matter more than necessarily external kind of signalers. So those might be important as well, depending on the social context, right? Okay. Howdy.